Hello and welcome to another episode of Financial Deep Dive with CWT. For today's episode, things are a little bit different. So instead of, usually with this show, what I do is, I research a bunch of different stocks that I'm interested in. And then, since I've already done the research on them anyway, I just make an episode talking about the stocks. Some of them, I get to the end and I conclude that they're stocks that I should own. So then I buy the stocks. And a lot of times what happens, and probably most of the time what happens, I'll research a stock, conclude that this is not a stock that I want to buy at this time, and then I'll still make an episode on it and kind of detail those reasons. But in this episode of the show, I really want to talk about this podcast itself. So, when I launched Finance by CWT and created financebycwt.com, I really did it to blog. And, that's done really well. Like, some of the blogs have gotten a good amount of traction, and I really enjoy it. Like, I've always really enjoyed writing. And since I was writing about a bunch of different stocks, I had the idea to make a podcast. And at first, I made the podcast just to talk about really the news. I talked about things that were happening in the finance world. But, that was fun and all. I wanted to create timeless content. Like, I wanted to create episodes where if someone 5 years from now discovered this podcast, they could go back to episode one, listen, and it still be, at least semi-relevant to now. So, I started doing the same thing really as the blogs, where I just find different stocks, and instead of writing about them, a lot of times I still do write about them, I just create a podcast episode, and I talk about a bunch of different ones. And sometimes I still talk about the news, like what is currently happening, but it's different. And I've been doing that for a while now, and I started uploading the episodes to YouTube, and that's been really good because what I noticed, YouTube's a lot putting a podcast on YouTube is a lot different than putting a podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and podcasting platforms. And the reason that I say that is because every single episode that I publish, gets a pretty consistent amount of viewers through all the podcasting platforms. Some pop off more than others, but it's a lot more consistent. When you post on YouTube, some of them do, pretty well. Some of them don't do well at all. I feel like the variety and viewership's a lot different. And it's also different on how to upload it. Like this podcast, I'm uploading to YouTube, but, I'm not really in it. I'm going to find a background image to put on the video, and that's all people are going to see. It's basically just going to be the podcast. And I don't really know how I feel about doing it that way. Because when you publish on YouTube, or when I watch a video on YouTube, if I also find a video where there's just a picture and you're really just listening to it, it's kind of difficult. You have to leave, unless you pay for premium, you have to leave the actual app open. You have to just sit there, and then you just sit there looking at a picture that's not moving. And my experience might not be the same as it is for others, but I don't really like that format as well. And I'm fine recording the actual shows in person, actually setting up a camera recording, and I've done that for quite a few episodes. But again, there's pros and cons to that too. With this podcast, I like stopping it every now and then and looking at the notes that I made, which you can't really do if you're recording. You can, but you got to edit it and all that stuff. But yeah, it's really difficult deciding how I actually want this podcast to go on YouTube. I know that I do want it to go on YouTube because I've been looking at a lot of different shows, podcast shows, and when they publish on YouTube, they can get a lot more viewers from it. I don't think it's as good a viewer because I feel like you make more off the podcasting audience than necessarily the YouTube audience. But yeah, it's definitely a platform that the podcast has to be on. And yeah, I can't really decide what the best way to get it on YouTube is. This one, like I said, just gonna have a background image. Maybe I'll do it where I can constantly shuffle images so that way the screen's at least moving, which makes it easier to watch, because I don't want it to be a difficult thing to sit through. I want people to be able to easily watch it. But yeah, that being said, that's one thing that I haven't figured out yet, how to really get this podcast on YouTube. I mean, I deal with the articles, like the articles that I write on financespecificity.com. I just record myself reading them, find an image to put on it. And I mean, I've seen the amount of, like, the watch time stays pretty consistent. Like, people actually do watch the whole thing. But I feel like it's because those are like a lot shorter. And, this podcast is already shorter than I like it to be. It's not an hour long, which I think a good podcast should be an hour long. So I would like to figure out to make, like, I'd like to make this podcast longer. But yeah, I think that's interesting. And what I've mostly been doing with the show is just cutting it up into clips, like each topic a different video. So, like, 5-minute videos instead of, you know, like an hour long video or even like a 30-minute video. And that's been doing, I think, pretty well. But again, it's difficult to know which way I want this podcast to actually go on YouTube. And, that being said, there's also what I want to do with this podcast is make an actual schedule for it. Because my main focus needs to be the blog, actually creating articles. Because again, those do really well. And it could be that I'm a better writer than podcaster, which I think is definitely true, even though I do enjoy both quite a bit. But I found it's a lot easier to grow a blog than a podcast or even a YouTube channel. And that actually surprised me because I looked online and it should be the opposite. Like when I was researching, growing the different platforms, like it should be the opposite. But it has, for me, been a lot easier to grow the blog. I mean, I think it's easier to get a YouTube subscriber than an email subscriber, but actual just audience on each thing, the blog has done a lot better. So that's like my main focus is growing that thing. And I also just really enjoy blogging. So, but I really want to spend time on the podcast too. I want it to be a good show. And I think this podcast could be a really great show. I think there's a lot of awesome content that I can make with it. So right now I'm thinking I'm going to start a schedule, one episode a week. I'd like to get to 3 episodes a week, but for right now, 1 episode a week every Monday. And maybe a couple bonus ones in between. But yeah, every Monday I'm going to try to have a new podcast episode. So this episode will be published on Monday. And I'd like to get it on the YouTube channel the exact same day. Because right now, sometimes it goes on YouTube first, sometimes it goes on the podcasting platforms first. And that way I have a week, too, to find different stocks that I want to talk about. Find interesting that happens and create, the content. And, yeah, so that's one thing that's going to be changing is, now I'm actually going to have a definite schedule of every Monday for this show. And I'm going to be trying to find the best way to get the actual podcast on YouTube. Because, yeah, I definitely think YouTube's a place I need to be on. Because really what matters in a revenue standpoint, like forgetting the actual podcast itself, what matters with revenue is viewership over a month, basically. Like how much, like not even per episode, like how many people are listening every month. And, right now, what depends on the month, sometimes YouTube's higher, sometimes it's not. But, I think that'll be an easier way to get viewers. So, yeah, I do want it on there. Yeah, that's one thing that's going to be changing. The actual content's not really going to be changing. Like, I'm still going to be trying to find stocks. I'm still going to be researching the actual, stocks, like, over an entire week, and then building a show through that. And I'd like to make a Halloween episode soon where I basically am going to be looking at candy companies, which I think is going to be fun. And that's another thing I thought about doing, like, different theme for each one. Like, maybe making an episode on cruise line stocks, an episode on airline stocks. But I don't think I would invest in any of those. So I don't know if I'll technically do those, but just the idea of having like a different like theme for each one, which I think would be very interesting. But yeah, I appreciate everyone listening to this episode, and I would really appreciate if you subscribe on whatever platform you're currently listening on. And yeah, I'll be posting every Monday now. Thank you.